Ethan Calloway had seen his fair share of forgotten worlds. As an interstellar trader, he was used to desolate places, worlds left behind by the thriving centers of the galaxy. Zillara 4 was no different. Barren, wind-swept planet that most avoided, but there were still a few small colonies that needed supplies, and it was Ethan's job to deliver them. As he approached the outskirts of the colony, his ship, the Star Wanderer, hummed quietly behind him. The few human settlers here lived in prefabricated domes, surrounded by the crumbling ruins of an ancient alien civilization long lost to time. The eerie stillness of the place never failed to unnerve him. There was something about the silence that felt unnatural. As he unloaded the crates from his ship, a movement in the distance caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, dust swirling in the wind. But as he squinted, the figure became clearer. It was tall, slender, and definitely not human. Ethan froze. Standing just outside the colony's perimeter was a woman. At least she seemed like a woman. Her skin shimmered with a soft, pale glow, and her large, glowing eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She was wrapped in flowing robes that billowed gently in the breeze, her silver hair fluttering like strands of light. Ethan swallowed hard, his instincts screaming at him to stay put. But something in her gaze, something desperate, kept him from turning away. Hello, Ethan called out, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. He wasn't expecting a response, but to his surprise she spoke. You are human. Her voice was soft, melodic, yet it carried a weight that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. Yeah, he replied cautiously, taking a step forward. Name's Ethan. I'm just here to deliver supplies to the colony. She didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, glowing with an almost otherworldly sadness. I have not seen a human in a long time. Ethan frowned. He hadn't expected anyone, or anything, living outside the colony. Are you from one of the other settlements? He asked, though he already knew the answer. There weren't any other colonies this far out. She shook her head slowly. No, I am alone. Ethan took another step, his curiosity overpowering his caution. Who are you? The woman hesitated, as if unsure how to answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. My name is Zillara. I am the last. The last of what? Ethan thought. Before he could ask, Zillara took a step closer, her eyes pleading. I need your help. Ethan's heart raced. He had no idea who, or what, this woman was, but the desperation in her voice was impossible to ignore. Help with what? He asked, his throat suddenly dry. Zillara's eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to echo through the ruins around them. I need a partner. Without one, I will fade. Ethan stared at Zillara, trying to process what she had just said. A partner. Fade. None of it made sense. He had traveled to dozens of planets, encountered countless species, but this was something entirely new. His mind raced with questions, but the look in her eyes kept him rooted to the spot. Fade, he asked, his voice cautious. What do you mean by that? Zillara glanced away for a moment, as if the weight of her own words was too much to bear. My people, we are bonded in pairs. Without a partner, we cannot survive. We lose our energy, our life force, and eventually, we fade into nothingness. Ethan's stomach churned. It was clear now. Zillara was the last of her kind. Alone on this desolate planet, with no one left to bond with, she was facing a fate worse than death. Oblivion. I'm sorry, he said softly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. I didn't know. Zillara's eyes flicked back to him, her desperation cutting through the silence. You can help me, Ethan. You can save me. Ethan took a step back, the weight of her request settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. I don't understand. How could I help? I'm just a trader. I don't even know what you're asking me to do. You must bond with me, she said, her voice trembling. It is the only way. Bond with her. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't what he had signed up for. He was here to deliver supplies, not get involved in an alien bonding ritual. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to return to his ship, and leave this strange world behind. But as he looked into Celera's eyes, he felt a pull he couldn't quite explain. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. I mean, we're different species. I don't even know if it's possible. Celera took a step closer, her eyes pleading. It is possible. The bond transcends the physical. It is a connection of the mind and spirit. I can teach you, if you are willing. Ethan's mind raced. Every instinct told him to refuse, to get back to his ship, and leave this mess behind. But something in Celera's voice, something in the way she looked at him, made it impossible to turn away. You're asking a lot, he said, his voice quieter now. I barely know you. How can I agree to something like this? I have waited so long, Celera whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. My people are gone. My world is gone. You are the only one who can save me. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. This wasn't just about helping someone in need. This was a life or death situation. If he said no, she would die. But if he said yes, what would that mean for him? I don't know if I can do this, he said, shaking his head. This is too much. Celera's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Ethan's heart broke. She wasn't just asking for his help, she was begging for her life. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. I don't want to die alone. Ethan closed his eyes, his mind spinning. He had never felt so conflicted in his life. Every part of him screamed that this was too much to ask, but at the same time, how could he refuse her? All right, he said finally, his voice low. I'll help you, but I need to know more. What exactly does this bond mean? What will happen? Celera wiped a tear from her cheek, her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. Thank you, Ethan. I promise, I will explain everything. Ethan nodded, though the knot in his stomach hadn't loosened. He didn't know what he was getting himself into. But one thing was certain, he couldn't walk away now. The following day, Ethan found himself walking beside Celera through the ruins of the ancient Zeroni city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the broken stone pillars and crumbled walls. The air was thick with the quiet history of a civilization long forgotten. Yet, with every step, Ethan felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Celera moved gracefully, her shimmering robes flowing behind her like liquid light. There was a renewed energy about her, a spark that hadn't been there the day before. She had hope now. A fragile, flickering hope, but hope nonetheless. For Ethan, the situation was still overwhelming, but something about Celera's quiet strength kept him going. They reached the center of the ruins, where a massive stone structure stood, partially collapsed but still imposing. It had once been a grand palace, Celera had explained, where her people's most important rituals took place. Now, it was a place of memories, echoes of what once was. This is where it must happen, Celera said softly, her voice reverberating through the empty courtyard. She stopped at the base of a wide staircase that led up to what had once been a ceremonial platform. Her eyes were filled with reverence, and for a moment, Ethan could see just how much this place meant to her. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the desolate landscape. What exactly is this bond we're talking about? I still don't really understand how it works. Celera turned to face him, her glowing eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him catch his breath. The bond is more than a partnership. It is a merging of minds and spirits. My people believe that true strength comes from unity, from being connected to another on a level that transcends the physical world. Ethan raised an eyebrow. So it's like telepathy? Not exactly, Celera explained. It's deeper. Once the bond is formed, we will share emotions, memories, and even thoughts. Our lives will be intertwined. It's how my people survived for centuries, through the strength of these connections. Ethan swallowed hard. The idea of merging minds with another being, especially one from a different species, was daunting to say the least. And what happens if I don't do it right? Celara's gaze softened. There is no wrong way. The bond forms naturally, if both hearts are open. But if you choose not to go through with it, she hesitated, glancing away. Then I will fade. The reality of the situation settled heavily in Ethan's chest. He was the last chance for Celara, the only thing standing between her and oblivion. But forming a bond this deep, it felt like a step he wasn't prepared for. Do I get a choice? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. Celara turned back to him, her expression unreadable. Yes, she said softly. But once the bond is made, it cannot be undone. Ethan nodded slowly. This wasn't something to take lightly, and he needed to be sure. But as he looked at Celara, at the loneliness in her eyes, at the weight of centuries pressing down on her, he knew he couldn't leave her to die. Not when he had the power to save her. All right, he said, exhaling a long breath. Let's do this. Celara smiled. A small, tentative smile, but it was enough to fill the air with a sense of hope. She stepped forward, reaching out her hand toward him. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before taking it, her cool skin sending a slight chill through him. Close your eyes, she instructed gently. And open your mind. Ethan did, as she asked, his heart pounding in his chest. The world around him seemed to shift, the quiet ruins fading into the background, as an unfamiliar warmth filled the space between them. He could feel Celara's presence more clearly now, like a gentle breeze brushing against his consciousness. The bond was forming. The air inside the ancient chamber was thick with anticipation. The grand ceremonial platform, though weathered and cracked, still stood proudly at the heart of the ruins. As Ethan and Celara stepped onto it, he could feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down on him. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed the space in a golden hue, adding to the surreal atmosphere. Ethan's heart raced as he stood beside Celara, their hands still lightly clasped. He had agreed to this, but the enormity of what he was about to do was beginning to sink in. His life as a solitary trader felt a million miles away. Here, on a forgotten planet, he was about to bond his very soul to an alien being, someone he barely knew, but whose fate was now intertwined with his own. Celara's voice broke the silence. This is the place where the Zeroni performed the bonding ritual for centuries. The energy here is strong. It will guide us. Ethan glanced around at the towering stone walls, their surfaces etched with strange symbols and intricate carvings. The remnants of the Zeroni's once great civilization seemed to watch over them, their history whispering through the air. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice barely audible. Celara nodded, her expression serene. I am, but only if you are willing. Ethan took a deep breath, nodding slowly. I'm ready. Celara stepped forward, her shimmering robes trailing behind her as she moved to the center of the platform. She closed her eyes and began to speak in her native language, her voice soft but resonant. The ancient words seemed to vibrate in the air, and Ethan felt a strange warmth begin to surround him. It was as if the very stones of the ruins were coming to life, pulsing with a quiet energy. Celara's chanting grew louder, more intense, and Ethan could feel the bond between them strengthening. His mind began to swirl with unfamiliar sensations, emotions and memories that weren't his own. He saw glimpses of Celara's past, moments of joy and sorrow, fragments of a life lived in a world far different from his own. He felt her loneliness, her longing, and her fear of the inevitable fading that awaited her if this ritual failed. Ethan closed his eyes, allowing the sensations to wash over him. It was overwhelming, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of peace in the connection they were forming. He could feel Celara's presence inside his mind, like a flickering light reaching out to him. And then, the ritual took a turn. Suddenly, Ethan felt a sharp jolt of energy surge through him, nearly knocking him off his feet. His eyes snapped open, and he saw Celara falter, her glowing skin flickering like a dying flame. Panic gripped him. "Celara," he shouted, stepping toward her. Her eyes opened, and for the first time since they had met, Ethan saw fear in them. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The bond. It's unstable." Ethan's heart raced. "What do you mean? What's happening?" Celara shook her head, struggling to keep her balance. "I don't know. It shouldn't be like this." Ethan reached out, grabbing her arm to steady her. The energy between them was erratic now, pulsing with a dangerous intensity. He could feel the bond slipping, like a rope fraying under too much strain. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. Celara closed her eyes, her face contorted with concentration. "We have to complete the bond," she said, her voice strained. "But it's too strong. It's too much." Ethan's mind raced. He didn't fully understand the mechanics of the ritual. But one thing was clear: if they didn't stabilize the bond, something terrible would happen. He could feel the energy inside him building to a breaking point, and he knew that if they lost control, it could destroy them both. Without thinking, Ethan pulled Celara closer, their hands still clasped tightly together. "We can do this," he said, his voice firm. "We have to." Celara opened her eyes, locking onto his with a mix of fear and determination. "You're right," she whispered. "We can." Together, they focused on the bond, willing it to stabilize. Ethan could feel the chaotic energy begin to settle, the wild pulses slowing to a more manageable rhythm. The connection between them deepened, becoming more solid, more real. The flickering light in Celara's skin began to brighten again, and the tension in the air started to ease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the energy between them calmed completely. The bond was complete. Ethan exhaled a long, shaky breath, his entire body trembling from the effort. Celara stood before him, her glowing eyes wide with relief. "We did it," she said softly. Ethan nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "Yeah, we did." But even as the tension faded, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now. Something had changed between them. The bond was stronger than either of them had anticipated, and he wasn't sure what that would mean for their future. The days after the bonding ritual were a strange blur for Ethan. His connection with Celara had intensified beyond anything he had anticipated. It wasn't just that he could sense her emotions or feel her presence. It was deeper, more profound, like their very souls were now interwoven. At times he could hear her thoughts, subtle whispers at the edge of his mind. Other times he would suddenly experience flashes of memories that weren't his own. Celara, on the other hand, seemed stronger. The shimmering light of her skin, once flickering and weak, now glowed with a steady warmth. The bond had given her new life, but it had also forged a connection between them that neither of them fully understood. As they traveled together through the ruins and back toward the human colony, the weight of their shared journey became more apparent. Ethan could feel Celara's lingering sadness, the pain of losing her people, her home. But mixed with that sadness was a growing sense of hope, something that had been missing for so long. And that hope was tied to him now. "This bond, it's more intense than I imagined," Ethan said one evening as they sat by the fire. The ruins were behind them now, and they had set up camp for the night on the outskirts of the colony. The stars above sparkled brightly in the clear night sky, casting a soft glow over the barren landscape. Celara sat across from him, her glowing eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "I know," she said quietly. "I wasn't prepared for this either. The bond, it's stronger than I expected." Ethan nodded, staring into the fire. "Can feel things, from you. Emotions, memories. It's like we're sharing more than just a connection." Celara hesitated, then nodded. The bond is meant to unite us completely. My people believe that true strength came from merging our spirits with another, but I didn't expect it to happen so quickly, or so deeply. Ethan looked up at her, his brow furrowed. Is that dangerous? Celara's gaze softened. No, not dangerous. But it can be overwhelming. For both of us. Overwhelming was an understatement. Ethan had never felt anything like this before. It was as if a part of him had been opened up, exposed, and now Celara was inside that part, her presence constant and undeniable. He could feel her sorrow, her joy, her fear, all of it flowing through him like a quiet undercurrent. It's strange, Ethan said, leaning back against a rock. I've spent most of my life alone. I got used to it. But now, it feels like I'm never alone. Celara's eyes softened, and she offered a small smile. You're not anymore. Ethan wasn't sure how to feel about that. On the one hand, there was a certain comfort in knowing that someone else understood him on such a deep level. But on the other hand, the intensity of the bond was something he hadn't prepared for. He hadn't signed up for this. And yet, here he was, tied to Celara in a way that went far beyond anything he had ever experienced. How do we move forward from this? Ethan asked, his voice low. Celara looked down at her hands, her expression thoughtful. We learn to live with it, to navigate it together. The bond is part of us now. It will guide us. Ethan stared into the fire, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what the future held for him and Celara, but one thing was certain. Their lives were now intertwined in a way that couldn't be undone. And that realization left him both comforted and terrified. As the fire crackled softly between them, Ethan felt a quiet determination settle over him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he wasn't going to abandon Celara. She had saved him in a way he hadn't expected, and now it was his turn to help her navigate this new chapter in their shared journey. For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he wasn't drifting through the galaxy aimlessly. He had a purpose now, and though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew that he wouldn't be facing it alone. The next morning, they resumed their journey back to the human colony. The quiet hum of the landscape was broken only by the occasional gust of wind, carrying with it the scent of dust and ancient stone. Ethan walked beside Celara, their steps in sync, the bond between them a constant presence. As they neared the outskirts of the colony, Ethan glanced over at Celara. What happens when we get there? I mean, what's next for you? Celara's eyes were fixed on the distant structures of the colony, but her voice was calm. I don't know, but I trust that whatever comes next, we will face it together. Together. The word hung in the air between them, filled with both hope and uncertainty. Ethan wasn't sure what his role in all of this would be. But he knew one thing for certain. His life had changed. And there was no going back. When they reached the colony, it was clear that something had changed between them. Ethan could feel the bond between himself and Celara deepening with every passing moment. The shared connection had moved beyond emotions and memories. Now it was as though their thoughts, instincts, and even their physical well-being were interlinked. The colonists, though few, noticed the change in Ethan immediately. He wasn't the same solitary trader who had arrived with supplies a few days ago. There was a lightness to his step, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. And Celara, glowing softly beside him, drew more than a few curious stares. Ethan's usual routine had been disrupted, but instead of feeling disoriented, he felt grounded. There was no escaping the bond now. It had become a part of him. As they settled into the colony, Celara began to share more about the ancient Zeroni practices, revealing the deeper layers of the connection they now shared. One evening, after the day's work was done, Ethan and Celara sat together under the stars, a peaceful quiet stretching between them. Ethan had grown used to the constant presence of Celara in his mind, the way her emotions subtly influenced his own. But something else was happening too. A shift that neither of them could fully explain. Do you feel it? Celera asked softly, her gaze fixed on the stars above. Ethan nodded. Yeah, it's stronger now, isn't it? Celera turned to face him, her expression unreadable. The bond is complete. We are one now, in a way that transcends what most beings experience. I didn't know it would be like this. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. He had never felt so connected to another person, let alone someone from a different species. It was as if they had become two halves of the same whole, their lives woven together by the ancient ritual that had saved Celera's life and transformed Ethan's. Does this change things for you? He asked, unsure of how to articulate the swirling emotions inside him. Celera gave a small, almost sad smile. It changes everything, but not in a way that should scare us. The bond is a gift, something rare even among my people. We share something that few others ever will. Ethan nodded, but the weight of the bond still pressed on his mind. It wasn't fear that he felt, at least not anymore. It was responsibility. He had taken on something far greater than he'd ever imagined, and now his life had a purpose beyond the endless wandering he had once known. You don't regret it, do you? Celera asked, her voice quiet. Ethan met her gaze, feeling the warmth of her presence in his mind. No, I don't. I need time to adjust. Celera reached out, placing her hand on his. We have time. We'll figure it out together. The bond between them pulsed gently, a reminder of the connection that now defined them both. There was no escaping it, but for the first time, Ethan didn't want to. This was his life now, shared, intertwined, and full of possibilities. Part 7. A new beginning. Weeks passed, and the bond between Ethan and Celera grew stronger with each passing day. The colony became their new home, a place where they could build a life together, despite the unusual circumstances of their union. The other colonists had accepted Celera with surprising ease, drawn to her calm presence and the quiet strength she radiated. Ethan had always thought of himself as a loner, someone who drifted from one place to another without ever putting down roots. But now, with Celera by his side, he found himself thinking about the future in ways he never had before. The bond had given him a sense of stability, of belonging, that he had never known. One evening, as they stood at the edge of the colony, watching the twin moons rise over the jagged horizon, Ethan felt a familiar tug in his chest. It was the bond, pulling him toward Celera. But it was more than that. It was a feeling of peace, of contentment. For the first time in his life, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. You've changed me, Ethan said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Celera turned to him, her eyes glowing softly in the moonlight. And you've changed me. We are stronger together. Ethan nodded, feeling the truth of her words resonate deep within him. The bond had transformed both of them, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. They were no longer two separate beings, but one, connected by a bond that transcended time, space, and even species. As they stood together under the stars, Ethan knew that his life had taken a turn he never could have anticipated. The loneliness that had once defined him was gone, replaced by something far greater, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of love. I'm glad I found you, Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. Celera smiled, her hand resting gently on his arm. I'm glad you didn't walk away. The future stretched out before them, vast and unknowable. But whatever challenges lay ahead, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't be facing them alone. The bond between them was unbreakable, and together, they could face anything the universe had to throw at them. As the moons rose higher in the sky, casting their pale light over the barren landscape, Ethan and Celera stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next.